This week on the video edition of the Business of Tech, the financials of security choices, NIST's new supply chain recommendations, the third anniversary of GDPR, why do we care, updates on Colonial Pipeline, and the flaw known before, highlights from Microsoft's Build, new market data, and lessons from Gen Z on remote collaboration. Hit that like and subscribe, and let's review this week's stories. In today's security news, let's look at some of the finances. Updating on payouts. CNA Financial, which is one of the largest U.S. insurance companies, paid $40 million to free itself from ransomware earlier this year, per a report last week in Bloomberg. The company's fourth quarter 2020 revenue, for perspective, was $387 million. The FBI is warning about at least 16 Conti ransomware attacks within the last year, with the gang sinking payouts as much as $25 million to decrypt systems. Amex has been fined £90,000 for sending 4 million spam emails to customers within a year. This from June 1st, 2018 to May 21st, 2019. And for comparison, Amex's fourth quarter 2020 revenue was $9.32 billion. Amex does get a discount on that fine if they pay by June 17th. Context has released research data showing that sales for anti-spam products has increased by 524% so far in 2021. Context also highlights data protection is up 102% and mail security up 30%. In recently released research from Fitch Ratings on ransomware and cyber insurance, premiums increased by 22% in 2020, and the direct loss ratio, which is the fraction of policy revenues paid out for claims, has risen to 73%. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is calling on the federal government to do something. In a letter to the Biden administration, they ask for making the issue a higher diplomatic priority, to disrupt the payment systems used by hijackers, to enhance global law enforcement efforts, and to create a fund for victims. So, why do we care? I've been thinking a lot about incentives, particularly as they apply to finances in security. $40 million sounds like a lot, but when the company's revenues are over $1 billion, well, it's about 4%. Sizable for sure. In Amex's case, however, the fine amounts to what? 0.00025% of overall revenue? Here's the trend. Amex will laugh off that spam violation. I don't see a single executive worrying about that damage. Plus, there are tons of companies making money off those anti-spam products, so why change? The insurance companies, however, are watching their margins shrink. Premiums will continue to go up, and so will restrictions on payouts. Change happens when the finances change. I've said for a while that if the damage from these ransoms was physical, the calls for help would have come sooner. The Chamber sees that damage to business is sizable and disproportionate for small companies, and so thus the calls for government action. It's exactly the predicted list: law enforcement activities to make the dynamics change. Now, for an IT services company, the key learning around this is thinking more about the incentive structures in security. IT services companies are the intersection of this risk, and so understanding these dynamics and addressing them is going to be key. Now, in a story about that change, Axios is highlighting the change in behavior on CEO pay. Shareholders and companies are pushing back. Alliance Advisors issued a note that shows, quote, unusually low support levels, pushing back against executive compensations without reasons or rationale. 53% of Walgreens shareholders voted against their payout plan earlier this year, and Wells Fargo investors' support dropped, although still enough to approve the pay. AT&T, Starbucks, and GE have also had pay proposals shot down. Now, why do we care? So this is the second half of the story. If you want to see different behaviors, you change the incentive structures. The pushback is being examined after a year of a rough economy, business struggles, and displaced workers. It's hard to justify paying those massive pay packages in those conditions. I'll be interested to see if this change in behavior applies to tech. The companies discussed here are not tech companies. And those same companies, despite a ton of backlash, are doing financially incredibly well. Tech companies are not facing those same struggles. Thus, the interest is in watching this trend to see if accountability changes. And that's why we care. In the U.S., Senator Ron Wyden is calling for Treasury to expand the investment from the American Rescue Plan to focus on communities without access to 100 megs upload and download, beyond the definition of unserved or underserved communities. The call is to expand the definition from 25 megs down and 3 megs up to 100 megs up and down. In Europe, with the third anniversary of privacy law GDPR today, there's some studies on the impact. The fear of group legal settlements following a serious data breach haunts 90% of security leaders, while 85% are more concerned about the threat of regulatory fines, according to an egress report. It's a real threat. 47% of consumers said they would consider joining a class action lawsuit against an organization that leaked their personal data, and 67% were aware of their rights to take legal action under GDPR. Egress found that 91% of security leaders said they were turning to specialist insurance providers to cover them against cyber incidents and data breaches, or had already upgraded existing policies since GDPR came in. This is supported by some data from Splunk, indicating 84% of global organizations have suffered a serious security incident over the past 2 years, and 78% are concerned about more sophisticated supply chain attacks coming in the future. The Australian government is also considering mandatory reporting for cybercrime incidents. This per the Home Affairs head, who indicated this is considered, quote, an extension of the cybersecurity strategy released last year. Now, why do we care? Europe is important to watch as governments there are leading the way on privacy-related legislation to get a sense of what things look. So why do we care? Europe is important to watch as governments there are leading the way on privacy-related legislation. To get a sense of what things may look like in the future in the US, look to Europe. As I've spoken a lot about accountability and incentives lately, when there are guardrails that keep organization within the bounds, those leaders take the guidance a lot more seriously. Insurance alone isn't the answer. When you couple that with the personal and corporate responsibility imposed by a law like GDPR, from my vantage point, we're at least seeing somewhat different outcomes. Change the incentives, change the outcomes. But to do that, IT services companies need to ask harder questions about the incentives of those they work with. Let's borrow liberally from the National Law Review. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, jointly published a new resource as part of their ongoing efforts to promote awareness of and help organizations defend against supply chain risks. The publication, Defending Against Software Supply Chain Attacks, provides recommendations for software customers and vendors, as well as key steps for prevention, mitigation, and resilience of software supply chain attacks. Here's 2 key recommendations. NIST recommends establishing a formal organization-wide cyber supply chain risk management, or CSCRM program, to ensure that supply chain risk receives attention across the organization, including from executives and managers within operations and personnel across supporting roles. NIST recommends that organizations develop and implement a vulnerability management program to scan for, identify, triage, and mitigate existing software vulnerabilities. Now, why do we care? NIST's recommendation is to look for vulnerabilities. Let's pair that with the recent UK Cyber Centre's recommendation to turn on automatic patching for all devices. The future of patch management looks like just scanning to make sure patches are happening, not acting as a blocker to slow the process down with any verification. You thus handle exceptions. Think of this in the context of a business process layer IT services company. You care a lot less about implementing things like patch management and more about just ensuring you handle exceptions. That's a different offering for sure than the traditional managed service. Let's start by highlighting a piece over on the MIT Technology Review. Here's your summary. On January 11th, Bitdefender announced a flaw in the ransomware that DarkSide was using. Companies could download a free tool from Bitdefender to avoid paying ransoms. The company, however, was not the first to find the flaw. 2 security researchers had already noted it and were looking for victims to help discreetly. Bitdefender's announcement was not unnoticed by DarkSide, who publicly thanked the company in a statement. Quote, "Special thanks to Bitdefender for helping fix our issues," DarkSide said. "This will make us even better." And DarkSide unleashed a string of attacks, including on Colonial Pipeline. Link to the full story in the show notes. Speaking of Colonial, the Department of Homeland Security is moving to regulate cybersecurity in the pipeline industry. Per the Washington Post, quote, "The Transportation Security Administration, a DHS unit, will issue a security directive this week requiring pipeline companies to report cyber incidents to federal authorities," senior DHS officials said. It'll follow up in coming weeks with a more robust set of mandatory rules for how pipeline companies must safeguard their systems against cyber attacks and the steps they should take if they are hacked, the official said. The agency has offered only voluntary guidelines in the past. Unrelated, a punitive class action suit that charges Colonial Pipeline Company's negligence led to the ransomware attack that caused its pipeline to be shut down and to increased gas prices has been filed against the company. Finally, FireEye has released new research highlighting that attacks against operational technology and control systems are increasing, but the attack methods are not sophisticated. So why do we care? 3 reasons. First, regulation. This is the process. The government first sets out guidelines which are optional, such as all of the guidance from NIST. Then, it makes that guidance required when industry itself doesn't fix things. If you're crowing that you don't want government to step in and that industry self-regulates, well, here's some evidence that that isn't true. If the industry self-regulated, it wouldn't have this problem. The incentive structure isn't there. Just like the cheapest solution to waste disposal is dumping it in the river. Society likes clean water, so government says you can't do that. The second reason we care. Security software companies are playing a PR game to tout their own solutions, and they're doing so with no skin in the game. Let's say a Bitdefender customer is breached. Do they have any actual skin in the game for the damage? I'm picking on them because of this sequence of events, but don't think they're alone. I'm not advocating security by obscurity. Keeping everything secret as protection doesn't work. That said, did that press release help customers? Third, negligence. I made the prediction for this year that criminal negligence charges would be appearing over security incidents. It isn't quite that level yet, but it's not hard to spot the trend here. Why we care is risk management. IT services companies are assuming this risk and are the last ones holding the bag if something goes wrong. That pressure is going to grow unless the dynamic changes. FireEye's report tells the key story. These attacks are not sophisticated. In many cases, the basics aren't done. Do the basics, and know that taking on a customer who won't take your guidance is much more dangerous than it's worth. Let's not make this a totally dreary episode. Justin Sean Johnson pleaded guilty to stealing the personally identifiable information of 65,000 employees of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Johnson, also known in the dark web as the Dearth Star or Dirthy Star, was charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, and aggregated identity theft in a 43-count indictment filed last year in May 2020. He remains detained pending sentencing. Now, why do we care? Chalk one up for law enforcement. The U.S. attorneys and the Secret Service's comments were specifically calling that accountability out. Domestically, the system really does work. The reason we care is to be prepared for the event of a breach with a procedure and system to work with law enforcement. In the event of emergency, break glass. As we know much of the criminal activity is outside the U.S., call your elected officials. Let them know international standards and norms via diplomacy, as well as enforcement, matters to you. Want to ask, why do we care? T-shirts, stickers, water bottles, and even aprons. Pick up some of our great stuff at the link in the description below and support the show directly. The PC market should see double-digit growth this year despite the chip shortages. IDC thinks it should have a growth level of 18.1% in 2021. It's short, however. The prediction for 2022 will drop slightly by around 2.9%. How about cloud? IDC says that Microsoft and Amazon Web Services are now tied on public cloud services with 12.8% revenue share each. The worldwide market grew 24.1% year over year in 2020, and within that, infrastructure as a service grew 33.9% year over year. SaaS applications were 18.6%, and SaaS system infrastructure 22.4%. Gartner reports that M&A will hit a record high this year in tech. While it hit its lowest level in 2 years in the second quarter of 2020, it rebounded, and by fourth quarter was at 2018 levels. And the analyst expects to see more. And Barracuda MSP has put out a study of the MSP landscape. Security is top of mind in providers and customers' concerns. Link in the show notes. That said, Trend Micro's data pairs with that. 70% of IT security and SOC decision makers say their personal lives are being emotionally impacted by their work managing threat alerts. So why do we care? PCs are still in demand, but it won't be forever. Cloud, however, is. I've been high on Microsoft, seems I'm not alone, as they've certainly been growing faster. This isn't a winner-take-all market, as there's clearly room for multiple players. Security is all about risk management. I have an editorial scheduled for the weekend to go deeper, but today's item is that connection between the concerns and mental health. This isn't easy. While it's a need, it comes with cost too, and that has to be built in to service delivery. Big tech should help pay to close the broadband gap, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr said in a commentary piece for Newsweek. Quoting that piece, "Big tech has been enjoying a free ride on our internet infrastructure while skipping out on the billions of dollars in costs needed to maintain and build that network. Ordinary Americans, not big tech, have been footing the bill for those costs." Speaking of the broadband benefit, Jessica Rosenworcel, acting chairwoman at the FCC, recently revealed that more than 1 million households have enrolled in the emergency broadband program. Now, why do we care? I was intrigued to see the FCC come out focused on the use of infrastructure. There's a big thought. What if it was paid for by the technology companies? I'm not advocating that particular solution. My point all along has been rethinking the way we approach broadband. What we're doing now isn't working. Is it a utility? Should it be financed by big tech? Or is the answer just yes? In a sign that things really have changed, the Washington Post has an examination of the change for federal workers over work from home. The Biden administration is working on changes to the telework policies for federal agencies, expected to be a hybrid option of in-person and at-home options. This is expected to be announced in June. Individual agencies will be able to determine their own needs, though the endorsement of a work-from-home culture is at the core of this. Per a survey of federal workers, the share of telework every day was 3% before the pandemic and 59% at its peak last year. The hope is to be able to recruit more widely around the country, as well as bring in younger talent. Challenges will include the federal real estate footprint and pay discrepancies across regions. Now, why do we care? As a longtime Washington region resident, I can tell those of you that aren't from this area what a big cultural change this is. The challenges of a dispersed workforce for the Fed are similar to what private businesses face, but so are the upsides. It should also be a pretty clear indication that if an organization considered as traditional as the federal government is adapting, then the bar has raised for competition on work. A federal job is often a good one. Career track, solid employment, great benefits, and now it could be available anywhere in the country, not just in the DC metro area. Microsoft's Build conference was this week, so let's catch up on the announcements there. The company was focused on Teams, an expansion of APIs to allow for more types of apps, as well as the ability to create your own customer meeting scenes. Part of their pitch, your apps built for Teams can work across Windows, Mac, the web, iOS, Android, and Linux. The company is going to open up in-app purchases in the store and tap into real-time audio and video data. Teams also got options for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code to make development easier. Microsoft also teased a major new revision to Windows coming soon. The company also announced that the promised support for Linux GUI apps will be in the next Windows 10 release. Finally, enhancements to Outlook, notably improved shared calendars. While we're on Microsoft, after shutting down their Azure Blockchain as a Service offering, the company is showing off its Azure Confidential Ledger service. Quoting ZDNet, Azure Confidential Ledger, like the Azure Blockchain Service, builds on the idea that blockchain is a distributed ledger. Microsoft's Azure Confidential Ledger adds an additional layer of security and scalability on top of blockchain. ACL uses the Azure Confidential Computing Platform, meaning an instance of ACL runs in a dedicated and fully attested hardware-backed enclave. Now, why do we care? Teams as the business platform is the Microsoft strategy and easily where I think the most opportunity is for a services company. Business transformation? Yes, please, it happens here. How many small IT services companies will be adding development capability to take advantage of that? There's a coming change to Windows too. Here's my question. With Mac OS having a Unix base and Linux support coming along, will app development get easier? I don't have the answer there. If there's a listener with insight, I'd love to learn more. Here's your esoteric piece for the weekend. I nixed talking about Facebook's change in their algorithms. They're now not amplifying users who provide misinformation. And instead wanted to focus on a piece that explores Generation Z's use of social tools for studying. Yes, for the way they collaborate for schoolwork. Quoting Every.2. The study web is a constellation of digital spaces and online communities across YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, Discord, and Twitter, largely built by students for students. Videos under the hashtag StudyTalk have been viewed over 500 million times. Why are millions of students from around the world spending countless hours online, tangled in the study web of their own design? In the highly pressurized pursuit of the academic goals they've been told will help them succeed, students venture into study web to feel less alone, taking away anxiety with inspiration, pursuing perfect grades through parasocial productivity, and quelling fears about the future with cyber friends. As Zoom School has left young people even more desperate for connection and support, they're turning to study web, post to post, DM to DM, and webcam to webcam in order to find it. Now, why do we care? The why we care is about the creation of online culture and the use of these tools for collaboration. If you believe, like I do, that you can borrow ideas from other industries, the idea of helping manage culture and mental health using these collaboration tools is of real note. Creative thinkers will be borrowing concepts. The way these students use the cameras for establishing shared presence and the way they collaborate for accountability give food for thought for smart business leaders. There's an obvious generation gap to point out here too. These students took to the tools and thought of creative new ways to leverage them. Are you taking advantage of that creativity in your own business and your thinking? Thanks for tuning in to This Week in the Business of Tech. Shows come out each week, pulling together the daily podcast. If you like this show, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. The content here is possible because of supporters like you. If you want access to shows early, answers to your questions, and private interactions, join our Patreon. It's pay what you want. You decide what the content is worth. Join at patreon.com/MSPradio. Patreons also get access to the written versions of every story as they come out. If you want the stories right away, you can get them on the daily podcast. Find The Business of Tech on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows. Subscribe links at businessof.tech, and I'll talk to you again next week.